Almost all conventional cameras have the option of changing the way in which they assess a scene so that the correct exposure can be calculated. This process is known as metering, and at its default settings, the camera will typically analyse the scene as a whole to provide the best exposure for the main subject and its surrounding details. There are, however, usually a handful of alternative metering options which influence this process, and one of these is known as spot metering. But what exactly does this do, and how do you use it? Spot metering uses a much smaller portion of the scene to decide the exposure than the other options available. Whereas the standard evaluative or matrix pattern looks at everything in the scene to check brighter parts and darker parts, and also uses information from the focusing point selected, the spot metering method limits the details it looks at to a much smaller area, and it will only use the information measured in this area to make its assessment. Because of this, spot metering is particularly useful when your subject only occupies a small part of the frame, and particularly when it may be much brighter or darker than its surroundings. The most common application is when shooting flowers, which may appear differently to any surrounding areas such as foliage or against a bright sky. Using the standard evaluative pattern here may produce good results too, although your camera won't necessarily know to prioritise the subject over the other details, which can mean that the subject ends up with a less than ideal exposure. When using spot metering, the camera will deem what falls inside the circle as the midtone. Because of this, you'll find that the exposure readings change quite easily as you place this spot metering circle over much brighter or darker parts of the scene. Pointed at a relatively bright area, for example, the camera will deem this to be the midtone, which will render this area darker than usual and will typically underexpose the rest of the scene. Pointed at a shadowy area, meanwhile, the camera will overexpose this area for the same reason, and other details are also likely to be recorded with overexposure. The actual area used for measurement will typically be shown when spot metering is selected, so that you can make sure the subject fills this space. This may only account for around 2 or 3% of the scene. One area where cameras differ, however, is what happens when you use a focusing point that isn't in the centre of the array. On some cameras, this area moves as different focusing points are selected, so that you can continue to use spot metering with off-centre focusing points, although many cameras don't support this, and will continue to meter with this circle whichever focusing point you use. It's possible that your camera's manual may indicate which is the case for your particular model, so check this if you're not sure. For more tips and advice, visit us on Twitter, Facebook or Google+, or check out wexphotographic.com/blog.